But there was one thing I had to do, and I had to go in, and I had to quit my job at that metals company. I bet everyone in this room had that same experience, or pretty close. And I went to the metals company, and I sat down with the two owners, and I looked them in the eye, and I said, I'm going to be successful, and this is my idea. And you know what they did? Anyone? They laughed. They said, kid, a cigar of the month club? That is the most ridiculous idea I've ever heard. We're going to keep your office here, because when you run out of money in 6 weeks, we're going to hire you back, but with a 20% pay cut. These weren't exactly the words of encouragement that I was hoping for, but I'm glad they said that because I was mad as hell. And I left that office, and I was determined to prove these guys wrong. And I knew the only way my business was going to work is if I could reach the masses. I had to get as many people as I could to pick up that phone, call that 1-800 number, and place an order. So I got back to the apartment, and our $24,000 was now down to about $9,000, and I realized that that wasn't going to buy me much of an advertising campaign. So I sat down at the computer, and I typed a letter explaining how cigars around the world worked. And at the end of the letter, I asked for help. And I took that letter and I put it inside of an envelope, and I put the envelope inside of a box because I knew a box would always get opened before a letter. And I put some cigars in there. And then I went down to the local costume shop, and I bought a pair of these thick Coke bottle nerd glasses that you would wear on Halloween. And I taped a little note right on the bridge of those glasses. And the note read, please take a closer look at my business idea. And I put those glasses on top of the cigars that were on top of that envelope. And I sealed this box up, and I made 10 of them. And I sent them out to the top 10 morning radio shows in Chicago. And about a week after those packages went out, I got a call from the producer of the #1 morning radio show. It was the Jonathan Brandmeier morning radio show. And she called me up and she said, Brandmeier will have you on the air for 5 minutes to talk about cigars around the world. She said, make your 5 minutes count, kid. And as entrepreneurs, sometimes we only have 5 minutes to make that impression. So I go to the radio station the day that I'm supposed to, and I meet this Brandmeier guy, and I hit it off instantly. And my 5 minutes turned into 35 minutes at the heart of morning rush hour when everyone's in their car listening to the radio. And this Brandmeier guy's telling his listeners how he's been a member of this Cigar of the Month Club for years. Hell, I wasn't going to say anything. Giving it to all of his relatives for the holidays, and they loved it. I mean, this guy was brilliant. And he kept giving out my 1-800 number every 15 or 20 seconds. It was amazing. And I left the studio, and I'll never forget that day because I couldn't get a cab to save my life in Chicago, and I had to sprint back to the little apartment where our office was. It was probably 3/4 of a mile, and I swing that door open, and I'm all out of breath. And I see my buddy John. He's got one phone on his left ear, one on his right ear. Every phone we have in that little apartment is ringing off the hook. And I leap over, and I grab the first phone that I can, and I take an order from this woman, and she orders a 12-month membership to Cigars Around the World. And I had to pause, and I had to ask her, are you sure? I hung up the phone. I looked over at my buddy John. I said, John, it looks like we're going to be in business for at least a year because I just took a 12-month membership. Recognizing an opportunity and seizing it. So I took that same letter, and I sent them to radio stations in New York and Los Angeles and Detroit. And sure enough, all these radio stations were having me on the air, and it wasn't costing me a penny. Now, when you're an entrepreneur, you're always looking to take a good idea and make it better, right? You want to grow it. You want to push the limits, see how far you can take it. So I thought to myself, this letter and these Coke bottle glasses, this really works. But what's the next logical step? You know, it works with radio. I figured TV is the next logical step, right? I figured Oprah and I could sit down on her couch and have a cigar together and talk about what a great gift this would make. So I modified that letter, and I went to that local costume shop, and I bought every pair of those Coke bottle nerd glasses that I could find. And I made 50 of these packages, and I sent them out to every single daytime talk show on television. And about a week after those packages went out, I didn't get a call. 2 weeks go by, still no call. It was probably Wednesday or Thursday of that third week, and I finally got my first call from that wave of packages that went out, but it wasn't quite the call that I'd hoped for. I got a call from the producers of the Danny Bonaduce daytime talk show. Danny Bonaduce had a nationally syndicated daytime talk show that was on the air for about 6 weeks. I got on that show twice in 6 weeks. But then I got our products on Good Morning America, and we got them on CNN. And within the first 30 days, we had those phone lines on for business. We had over 1,000 members to the Cigar of the Month Club. And then the next season was Father's Day, and we picked up 3,000 members. And this thing kept going and going and going. It was growing. And then the world changed. It was the dot-com boom started to take off. And as an entrepreneur, I realized that we had to change with the times, because if we didn't, we were going to be out of business. And I slowly redirected our efforts out of the Cigar of the Month Club business, getting into selling cigars to casinos and resorts and country clubs. And thank God we were agile. Thank God we changed our plan, took those blinders off, and saw opportunity around us. Because our competitors who were doing the beer of the month and the wine of the month, they couldn't survive. They couldn't sustain the business model that they had because they didn't want to change. And just as I had started changing the company over, I'd sold the business, and an opportunity popped up once again. A friend of mine, this girl I went to college with, her mother was a talent agent in Chicago for children. And she somehow got this random fax that came across her desk. And it was a fax looking for young entrepreneurs to compete, and the winner would become Trump's apprentice. She asked me what I thought. I said, it sounds rather interesting. Could you send me an email what this is all about? And she said, well, no, actually, I can't. I made you an appointment on Tuesday at 1 o'clock. You better be there. So I go to this meeting, and I meet with these producers from Hollywood, and they start explaining the concept of The Apprentice. You know, there's 2 teams, and they're going to start a new business from scratch each week, and there's a winning team and a losing team, and pretty much everyone knows what happens when you lose, right? Donald gives you you're fired. And they had 250,000 people that applied, and they narrowed it down to 50, and then they weeded the 50 down to 16, and they asked me to compete on the show, and of course, I said I would, and the guy said, well, there's just 2 conditions. One, you have to wrap up all your business in Chicago and be in New York. You've got 2 weeks to do it. And the second condition is you cannot tell anyone where you're going to be for these 13 weeks. He said, but don't worry. We've got some producers in the next room. They're the best producers in Hollywood, and they're going to create a story for you to tell people where you're going to be, so no one's on your trail. You know, this was the first season of the show. Everything was very secretive. So I got up from that meeting, and I went into the room with these top producers in Hollywood, and they told me that I was going to be going to Havana, Cuba, to buy tobacco fields, and I would have no contact with the outside world. These are the best producers in Hollywood? It's illegal for a U.S. citizen to go to Cuba, for one. I found that to be rather amusing, but what I found more amusing is my buddies actually believed me. I thought I used to hang out with some sharp guys, but apparently not. So we come to New York, and I'm ready to take on the big business of Manhattan, and I'll never forget that day because we get saddled with our first task. And our first task was to sell lemonade in the middle of Midtown Manhattan, probably not too far from this hotel. And I'll never forget looking up to the heavens thinking, dear God, what have I just gotten myself into? It's 95 degrees outside. I'm in a suit and tie pushing this lemonade. No one will ever take me seriously in the business world again. But then the task slowly got a little more complicated, and the sleep deprivation started kicking in. You know, you're operating on 2 to 3 hours of sleep a night, much like when you first started business. And the competition started to slide. And then before I knew it, I looked to my right and I looked to my left, and there was only one other person still standing there, and it was just my luck. This guy happened to have his MBA from Harvard. So it was the Harvard MBA versus the entrepreneur, and we battled it out in a fierce competition. And then in front of, I think, 25 million people on live national television, the decision was made, and Trump gave me the nod. He hired me on, and it was a great moment, but my celebration was short-lived because I was immediately whisked away, and I had to go on a 2-week tour of all the talk shows. You know, Larry King, Jay Leno, Ellen. Where were those people 16 years ago when I was stuck doing Danny Bonaducci? Now they all wanted me on their program. And then I finally finished that, and I made my way back home to Chicago, and I was sitting in my family room, and it was kind of a surreal moment. And I started thinking to myself, why me? What separated me from the pack of all these people who wanted to win this? There were 250,000 people who applied. And I think first and foremost, I thought like an entrepreneur. And when you think like an entrepreneur, you possess certain traits that are different from everyone else. And one or two in particular is you realize the importance of practical execution. When you think like an entrepreneur, you realize how important it is to deliver results. Most people talk a great game. They're going to write this book, or they're going to climb that mountain, or they're going to make $1 million doing this business. But 99% of them don't do it. They don't realize the importance of execution. Secondly, it's about agility. It's about changing up your game plan, taking the blinders off,